So our next speakers are Dwayne Oyler and Jenny Wu from the Los Angeles-based Oyler Wu. And their project, The Exchange, can be seen outside of the... Should we get the microphone? Maybe we should get the microphone then.
Oh yeah, we're getting more people in here.
And so you can see their project out by the I guess it's the Cummins Conference Center, the former Urban Union Bank, it was the first project that I saw when I got here, and it's pretty impressive. And I had an interesting conversation last night about the sort of continuation of these spaces into the contemporary, I guess, attitude about design in the city. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about the history of the site, and then how your kind of formal logics fed off of, or how the actual physical construction of your project was based on the different stages of this site and how it's been altered over the past.
It's a little early. Well, we started off looking at the site, and for anyone who doesn't know, we made use of 3 existing bank canopies, what used to be drive-through teller canopies. And even stepping back from that a little bit, when we were first given the site, the entire site was sort of up for grabs. And in fact, at some point, we were subtly encouraged to think about doing something in the grass in the park. And a couple of things came to mind. We first thought, what a shame to not think about a way to build on what's already there, both in terms of relating a little bit more to the site and getting a little bit more bang for our buck, and not literally, not financially so much as we could get more out of doing less if we figured out a way to move the canopies. Secondly, we didn't want to make a thing, we wanted to make a place, and it was important to us that it not be a kind of sculpture in the park. So the first was thinking about that, and then more specifically, we thought about the site as being this intersection between that portion of the Cummins campus and the downtown. People passed through it all day long, but it didn't quite have a sense of containment in the way that a place would. It was a place that people really passed through, with the exception of a handful of people that would have lunch there. So we immediately thought about how to kind of gather the 3 canopies into a thing that was somewhere in between a container. It was just enough to compel people to stop and enjoy the place, but still felt relatively porous. People felt like they could still move through it. You weren't enclosed, you weren't in the dark, you weren't unsafe, but it felt like a place. And then we turned to, when we started thinking about the specifics of how we would design the piece, we then turned to Saarinen. And Jenny and I, we've always said that we're not the type who quote precedents a lot. It's not generally a big driver of the work. But Saarinen is one of the 3 or 4 architects we've ever mentioned in a lecture. So we won the lottery getting that site. And there were some specific and kind of, it gets a little architecturally nerdy, for lack of a better word, the kind of things that we were looking at. But we first looked at the domes, and also for anyone who doesn't know, the domes were talked about as a negative of the trees that were planted all over Columbus, the honey locust. And so the idea was that inside there you'd get a negative, a very subtle but very beautiful nod toward those trees. And so we started thinking a little bit more about this idea of the negative and avoiding and making a space out of that. And we also tried to connect. We were thinking, well, what does that have to do with Saarinen's later work? We're especially drawn to a lot of the forms and shapes, experimentation that he was doing with things like TWA Terminal. And we thought about, well, what that ultimately accomplishes as a spatial idea inside the bank is it really lightens up the dome. So there's this negative, super light, and then you go to the Miller House across town, and there are these columns that come up. The space above them is voided, and light comes down at exactly the moment you don't expect it to. then relate that also later to Dulles Airport, where that idea is really in full bloom. And we thought, I think you could argue that the domes, the lighting of those domes, is his first way of thinking, how do I take these things above you, provide light in a relatively mysterious way? There's light that shines up on those domes. So we recognized this early interest in the bank. And so as we moved into making our piece, some of the first moves we made after we said, okay, let's subtly contain it by catching the corners, were ideas of voiding. So we're then carving pieces out of a lot of the solids and then placing pieces back in them so that you're getting light moving through the voids that we've created with other pieces floating in them that catch complex shadows but ultimately open these up more. And then at the other end, in order to create a variation of different forms of enclosure, there was the inverse of that, where the frame now holds a solid object as opposed to the solid object holding the frame element. I said a lot there.
That's good. Yeah, we want you guys to talk, not.
Well, I like her to talk. She's
Right.
smarter than I am.
Should I add to that, or is there more?
Yeah. And did you? I didn't know. We're just having a conversation. To discuss a little bit about, in some ways, as you mentioned, it's actually fairly respectful in the way that it doesn't bust out and it doesn't destroy the canopies. It doesn't hide the canopies. Though your work as a practice and what we see here, I think is what a lot of the public would think of as a contemporary architecture, right? Like, you're doing things that could not, whether they could or could not be done back then. I know this is like a handmade, it's a crafted piece. But could you, talk, sort of build on what you were talking about, where you took things away, which is a fairly simple move, and you put things back that was a very simple move. But the pieces themselves are very complex, right? There's the sinewy pieces, which, these trees are modern, right? They're modernist trees because they cast a certain type of shadow. Could you talk a little bit about, formulating these? It's all, it's lines, it's forms. Like, talk about that process of still being respectful, not breaking the stuff out, but making something that is not modern. It's contemporary, like, to the fullest.
Right. I think for us, obviously the site was important in activating it, and when Dwayne talked about making a place, that was really important to us. And how to address the place, we had to address the bank that's next to it. And I think the reason why the domes worked was that it played against the kind of square of the roof. And so I think that was a kind of datum that we wanted to keep. And so we kept the canopy as that kind of rhythm of the grid, and then kind of break out of it in these moments of erosion, or kind of adding these kind of movements and organic forms back into the frame side. I think, over the past week, we've been just sort of sitting and hanging out at our pavilion, and some of I would say our favorite comments about the pavilion has been, this thing feels like it's been here. It's always been here. At the same time, it feels completely new. And I think that to be able to do both was really, like, we didn't know if we could achieve that, and I think that was one of the hope, like the hopes for the project, that it will feel integrated at the same time, will feel completely contemporary and new.
Yeah, in some ways that's kind of a nice metaphor for it. Columbus. Oh, sorry. I think in some ways that's kind of a nice metaphor for Columbus too, the attitude that this is not something new, it's not something we're like digging up from the past, but it's kind of this continuation of something that's already here, or maybe highlighting, bringing forward something that's still here from the past, and maybe changed
right
over time.
Yeah, it's very easy to look around at many of these buildings now that have been here 50, 60, in one case, 70 years almost, and think it was a nice building at the time, and forget that it was actually kind of earth-shattering in its contemporary nature. So, yeah, I think the buildings that work well here do work very, very well with the context. They recognize that this is a city that needs to function, and the architecture needs to contribute something to that, but they were super forward-thinking. And so I think, like what Jenny described as it being new and fitting in, yeah, that's the ultimate goal of, I think, of an architect practicing in Columbus now, or doing work in Columbus, is to continually provide that shot in the arm that says, we're moving forward, but there's a sensitivity to it that recognizes what the place is about. I just wanted to say a couple things about the shapes and forms. There's an amazing quote by Sheridan on the front of the bank that I just read a couple days ago that says something about it starts out by saying essentially the architects, I'm not going to remember this directly, but it says something like architects need to be, in the beginning, be very sensitive to clients' needs and functions, but at the end of the day, architecture should not be the practice of compromise, that the architect needs a very strong will to prevent an architecture of compromise. And I think that a lot of the shaping and forming of the pieces were things that we brought to the table. There was a will to bring those, and the hope is that it doesn't. The worst thing that could happen is that someone says, "Yeah, it was just a sort of superimposed, foreign shape making that came to the site that didn't contribute." I hope that by bringing that will, it actually contributes something, and it does become a bit of that shot in the arm toward what contemporary issues are. And to even more specifically answer it, there isn't a single, are those shapes contemporary shapes? It's it really is a synthesis of different things related to both a kind of interest in shapes, but those shapes are a direct reflection of, for example, technologies that we've just become capable of creating in more efficient ways.
All right, thanks. That's great.
I think that's great. We're going to keep moving. And we're going to see you out there.
Yeah, great talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.